Good morning, and we are live. This is Sunday School with Murph, and I hope, uh, I don't know. My cell phone is what I use for my time, so it went back automatically. Hopefully, you set your clocks back if you're not up to date on the latest technology. Definitely needed that little extra hour of sleep last night. I had competition over in Gordo, Alabama, and my daughter and her band, marching band, did excellent. Superior ratings, all ones and everything, best in class for majorettes, best in class for the band. So very proud of them. They did a great job, and that was it was a long night, but it was a good night. So let's see. We're going to continue on. We're going to finish up King David today. I mean, there's so much there. There's so much there. You can get into First Samuel and read all about David and look at compare that to the Gospels and see where he did things similar to Jesus. And I mean, that's kind of what we've been looking at here, comparing and contrasting. And obviously, he wasn't the Messiah, but he was a prototype king, and he was a type of Messiah to come. So, foreshadowing of what God was going to do to restore his people. So, we've talked about him going up against Goliath. We talked about his calling, how he was anointed, how he was the least of his brothers, and that's who God calls. When you look at all these different Old Testament heroes and these types of Christ throughout the Old Testament, these characters, they're typically not the biggest, strongest guys. They're not maybe the smartest, or they're not the bravest. In the case of Gideon, he just picks the most unlikely people to do these tremendous things for the nation. So, as I've said with this salvation typology, there's kind of a pattern, or there's things that you catch on to, like there's maybe a period of exile, there's persecution, there's what I had 4 or 5 things that I did in the beginning of this. Let's see here. Some sort of temptation, some sort of rejection. They end up being sacrificed, although in David's case, he doesn't end up being sacrificed. He does die a natural death. But then there's some type of restoration. So it doesn't have to hit every single one of those marks, but you want 3 out of 5 to really be a true type. But we're looking at now picking up in 1 Samuel 19, where David has defeated Goliath. He's now becoming popular. He's now leading the armies. The Spirit of the Lord left Saul, is on David now. And what you run into is this strange situation. Again, Saul is given this harmful spirit, as one translation says, or sad spirit. It's not a good thing. The Holy Spirit was replaced by, it's never actually called an evil spirit, but it's not a good one. And it actually pushes Saul to the point where he starts trying to kill David. He's now jealous of David and his successes. They're actually out there chanting, Saul killed his thousands, David killed 10,000s. And of course, Saul is not the type of guy that can handle that. So he is he's dealing with things, and I think he's kind of figuring out this is interesting. Not registering any sound. I wonder if that's coming through on locals. Do we have any? That's interesting. Okay, now we have sound on locals. Now I have sound on OBS. That's strange. Very strange. All right, anyways, so I guess I'll look at that later. All right, so Saul is not handling David becoming popular. And you actually see where Saul is calling David before him to play music to soothe the savage beast, so to speak. And we see in 1 Samuel 19, verse 10, and Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul so that he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So David's playing music. Saul is sitting there with a spear in his hand the whole time. And finally, I don't know, he's getting irritated, whatever his issue is. It's supposed to be calming him down, but he decides that he doesn't like David anymore, so he throws a spear to kill him. And obviously he misses. And so it begins this journey, this path thing, where Saul's son Jonathan, who is best friends with David, has to actually go and plead for David's life. And of course, Saul lies and says, well, I promise I won't kill him. And then later on, you see in chapter 19, verse 20. Well, before that, of course, David had married, I would say Michael, could be Michal. It's Michal, so Saul's daughter that was given to him when he defeated Goliath. Saul sends people to go collect David to, again, bring him before him and kill him. And she lies and says he's not feeling well. And of course, then they find out, in which he escapes when all this is going on, and they find out that he's not really there. So it begins this process, and David ends up in Naioth near Ramah, and Samuel's there. And Samuel's got a bunch of prophets with him, and they're in the spirit and prophesying. And what exactly they're prophesying about, I don't know. It could be future events for Israel. It could be stuff about David's reign as king. It could be what's going to happen to Saul. It could be about Jesus. We don't know because it doesn't tell us. They're in the spirit and they're prophesying. And so David goes and hides out with them. And Saul begins to send messengers. So verse 19 and 20, then Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So the Spirit of God is there, and it's so heavy and it's so strong that everybody that gets into that little area there is taken over by the Spirit. So they're there to collect David to go kill him. God doesn't let that happen. And as you continue to read, actually, Saul gets upset. He himself goes, and then he ends up prophesying with everybody else. So it wasn't time. It was, the Spirit was on David, and that was who he had chosen to be king. That's who God had chosen. So God was going to make sure that is going to be fulfilled, and that David would become king. So he's not going to let anything happen to him. In a similar fashion, when we fast forward up to John chapter 7, verses 44 through 46, so the Sanhedrin is beginning to get irritated with Jesus, who's gathering a lot of followers through his signs and his teachings, and of course it's conflicting with some of the stuff they were doing and teaching, and they were jealous of God's chosen one. Let's see here, verse 44. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. The officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" The officers answered, "No one ever spoke like this man." So they got in the presence of God. They got in the presence of someone who had the Holy Spirit, and they were influenced. They were affected. They were in a good way. And again, here it wasn't time for Jesus to die. This is, it was the beginning of his ministry. It was, things had to happen in the way that God wanted them to happen. So, it's not time for that. So God's not going to let it happen. So, like I said, David is there with Samuel and these other prophets, and they're prophesying at Ramah. And everybody that comes, including Saul, everybody that comes to try and get him can't get him. So again, same thing happened to Christ, because it wasn't time for that yet. And what's interesting with David, to speak to his character, you'll read further on as you go through 1 Samuel that David had opportunities to kill Saul, and he never took them. And his thing was, this is God's anointed, this is the king of Israel. If I kill him by my own hand, then I'm going against God. Of course, Saul didn't have an issue with that. He'd been defying God the whole time. So, but again, David's character says it's not time. It's not my place to kill Saul. It's Saul does eventually get killed in battle, and everybody from his family is killed except for Mephibosheth, who ends up lame. But as you continue on in John chapter 11, verses 47 through 53, so the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. So Caiaphas unwittingly prophesies Christ being crucified. He doesn't understand the full scope of it, obviously, because he's saying this from a political standpoint as opposed to a salvation standpoint. And what we find with David, and so Jesus, Matthew 5:3, right? "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And we see that with Jesus, is he doesn't call politicians, and I mean he does, but they don't really answer. But the people that begin to follow Jesus are dispossessed for some reason or other. They're rejected. They're common people. There's just something about them that they're not accepted by a bunch of other people. And so that's kind of the following that Jesus begins to have. Well, David has a similar following. And so as he begins to run for his life, as Saul is trying to kill him, David ends up amongst Gentiles. And it's really weird because he spazzes out and acts crazy, because he's scared that they might kill him because he was technically their enemy. But when they see that he seemed crazy and mad and all this stuff, and that he seemed like he had abandoned Israel, they left him alone. And eventually they bring him in and actually allow him to go out and fight battles for them. And so he goes to defeat their enemies. In the process, he's also defeating Israel's enemies. So he's still fighting for Israel. He still loves Israel. He doesn't abandon Israel altogether. But he begins to bring salvation to these Gentiles in Gath, right? So that's in 1 Samuel 21. When you look verses 10 through 15 there, David flees to Gath. He pretends to be crazy. In 1 Samuel 22, he begins to gather a following of people who are in distress, in debt, or bitter in soul. Again, like Christ said, poor in spirit. So there was, for some reason, these were people who had run away from home, or had run away from whatever part of society because they owed money, or some issue. They had something going on. And so David actually amasses this little army of like 400 people, as we're told, and he goes and he's fighting these battles. And because he has the Spirit of God, every battle he goes and fights, especially if it's against the Philistines, he'll go to God in prayer and say, hey, God, should I go and attack these people? And even when his men say, no, don't do that, he goes back, God, what do you think I should do? And God says, hey, do it, and I'll deliver them into your hands. That's the phrase that gets used. So, it's that he brings salvation to the Gentiles first. He's being rejected by Saul and the nation of Israel to some extent. And as he is gaining in popularity, he's gaining a following, much like Christ. And it's a following that is a threat to the power structure in Israel, just like Christ. And so, it's just again, the whole contrast, the whole comparison thing there. Of course, it's the whole thing with him going nuts. He's dragging around Goliath's sword, which is almost bigger than he was. And he just looked weird. And it's one of those things where we kind of scratch your head and go, you know what if he trusted in God, or how would that have worked out if he'd have stood his ground against Saul? Clearly God had anointed him, and clearly God wanted him to be king. And so we do wonder what would have happened if David had, fully trusted in the Lord. That's kind of one of those things we get out of those verses, those messages in 1 Samuel 19 through 22 there. But whatever he does as a result, God allows his path to build up his character, to help him come to realize he needs to rely on God, to build up the following he's going to need in order to come in and establish himself as king. That's as you read further on in 1 Samuel there after chapter 22, when the ultimate battle where Saul ends up getting killed, and then what it took to establish David as king. He had already been anointed by God. He had already been, Samuel was there, and Samuel could verify and say, yes, this is the guy God picked. But you still had people that thought that somebody in Saul's line should have the throne. So that was a constant problem for David. So you have to do kind of earthly political things at the same time. It's part of the problem of having a king, as opposed to having a prophet or having God himself leading you. When you deal with people, you start to deal with issues. So it's incumbent upon us to put God up there. And just like David, God, should I go attack these people? God, do I need to go and help these Gentiles over here? And it does come down to a point for the Gentiles where they're finally like, look, dude, you need to go back to Israel. This is something weird's going on here. Things are not going to happen right. It's, you belong in Israel. You need to leave. And so he does eventually go back to Israel. But during that time, he brings salvation back. He brings salvation to those Gentiles by defeating their enemies. Like I said, he's helping Israel out by defeating their enemies at the same time. So a lot of them were in common. The Philistines were a constant thorn in everybody's side, not just the Israelites' side. But so David's constantly fighting the Philistines, and he's always winning. Again, he has the Spirit of the Lord. And again, he would go on to become a man after God's own heart. Even when we see, as we did did the lesson on David's illegitimate child. With Bathsheba, David screwed up. He had his flaws. David really wanted to build the temple. He wanted the Ark of the Covenant to be there in Jerusalem, and but God tells him, "You're a man of war. You've shed blood. You can't build the temple." So that gets put on to Solomon, and in this case, David himself kind of becomes the father, so to speak, a type of God. Because then Solomon becomes a type of Christ in that he's able to build the temple for God's house, and he does it on the same spot that on Mount Moriah there, where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. You run upon this issue towards the end of David's life. He does a census. And he's not supposed to do it. He did it for the wrong reasons. God didn't tell him to do it. And so this plague of death comes upon Israel. David goes out to Mount Moriah and does a bunch of sacrifices and stops the plague of death, just like Christ. And, he is sacrificed and stops the plague of death of God's people. So all kinds of stuff there. Again, continue to read through 1 Samuel, from 22 on up to his death, and see just this tremendous stuff that David did. He expanded the borders. He possessed all the lands. He did a lot of great things. And as I say, Solomon comes along, and this is Bathsheba's son. So David's first wife, Michal, I'll have to look up how to exactly say that too. But she is Saul's daughter, and Saul's bloodline is cut off. There cannot be any of Saul's descendants on the throne. And so if you notice, it's like, well, wait a minute, how does the Bathsheba and her children, how does that bloodline work when the firstborn, again, God takes people who he knows are not going to disqualify themselves. And of course, Saul's bloodline had been totally disqualified. So you couldn't have anybody with his blood that could be called a child of Saul. You could not have anybody like that on the throne, which is why God actually uses Bathsheba to give David Solomon, who would carry on the bloodline. And so just, keep looking at that, and again, go through John and just compare and contrast and look at and see how David is that type of Christ. And again, prototype, he's the first true king of Israel. He's the one that God chose to be the leader. Christ is the one that God chose to be the ultimate king of the world, but the ultimate king of Israel, who will also be king of the world during the millennial reign. And that's about, like I said, we could spend days and days and days and days and days working on this and continue to go through King David's life. A lot of interesting stuff, a lot of great history about the nation of Israel. look at something here. What am I gonna look up? I just lost my train of thought completely. That'll make for great video. But yeah, I mean, we could spend all. Oh, I know. Now I realize. I want to know the correct enunciation of this Greek word. Because I've talked about this before. I have this copy, and this is what we're actually going to get into. I can get a way to pronounce this. Well, that doesn't help. Looks like Didache. Yeah, it's an actual. It was a scroll they found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it appears to have been essentially a study guide, so to speak, for the first century Christians, Jews and Christians, and it was getting copied and passed around, sort of a summary commentary on what churches should be teaching. So we will do that next week. And we'll put the salvation typology on hold. We'll do the Didache, and I'll figure that exactly next week on how you say that. But we'll go through that, and then once we finish that, we'll start up on Hebrews. And Hebrews has, amongst all the great theology in it, it has a good portion of typology. And there's a number of people that will say that, a lot of the scholars will say that if it's not listed in Hebrews, it's not proper typology and you shouldn't use it or reference it. And some of the stuff I've covered isn't necessarily in there, or it's not in depth the way I've gotten into, or the way Mike Winger does. Pardon me. So that's what we got coming up the next couple weeks. It is November. We should be thankful every day, but obviously we got Thanksgiving coming up, and then of course Christmas right after that. So we should be thankful for God, and thankful for Christ, and thankful for His sacrifice, thankful that He was born. So it's that time of year. Temperatures, oh Lord, 75 in the afternoon here, and then it drops down to 40 at night. Messes you up. But if you don't believe in climate change, come to Alabama. It happens twice a day. But that'll wrap this up. So I hope you make it to church. I hope you have a church to go to. If not, come check out Lowrytown. And you could actually come and sit in person with me. Yeah, it's exciting, huh? But yeah, so find yourself a church, find yourself some fellowship if you're not going somewhere. Of course, continue to watch, share, like, comment on these videos. If you don't like it, share with 2 people and say, look at this idiot. So, with that being said, remember to do what Christ said to do, and that is to go out and make disciples. God bless, and I will see you next time.